Discussion about Rand Paul. I want to play a soundbite from Ted Cruz because Ted Cruz now is staking out his territory on these social issues, and he's staking out a different place on these social issues than is Rand Paul. So clearly what we're seeing now for social conservatives, there is a choice between at least these two candidates for 2016. There is a clear line of demarcation between Rand Paul and between Ted Cruz on the social issues that are preeminent in my judgment. Abortion is obviously the number one moral issue of our time. It is our national sin of today, as slavery was 150 years ago. We are shedding innocent blood. It is going to call the judging hand of God down upon this land. Thomas Jefferson said, talking about slavery, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. His justice cannot sleep forever. He was talking about slavery. He knew it was unjust. And he knew that God was a just God and that God was going to have to deal with that. And Jefferson was prophetic. How did God's wrath, how did his judgment fall on the United States for the sin of slavery? Civil War. 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. So the blood that was shed in war was atoning for the blood that had been shed in the slave trade. And that's what Thomas Jefferson said. It may be, he was wondering in his second inaugural, how long is this war going to last? And he said, it may be that this war will last until every drop of blood drawn by the lash, that is by the slaver's lash, shall be repaid by another drawn with the sword. Because he said God is a just God, and his justice, his righteous judgments are true and righteous altogether. So abortion is our sin. That's the number one issue. I mean, that's the moral issue number one. The second moral issue is what we're doing with human sexuality, specifically with the homosexual agenda. And as I've explained before, we have to choose as a nation between homosexuality and religious liberty because we cannot have both. It's impossible to have both. Every advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty. Got another example of it today. Dan Cathy, who is the founder of and CEO of Chick-fil-A, he is done talking about marriage. He's done. He's not going to say a peep about it again the rest of his life. Here's a piece from Talking Points Memo, which is a far-left website, so they're loving this. They're celebrating this. This is a big-time victory. They have beaten, the Gay Gestapo has beaten and bullied Dan Cathy of Chick-fil-A into silence and submission. So Big Gay has bagged another scalp, and they're ecstatic about it there on the left. The CEO of Chick-fil-A has no interest in being a culture warrior. That's how the story starts. It was nearly 2 years ago that Dan Cathy, the head of the fried chicken chain, voiced his opposition to both same-sex marriage and Supreme Court rulings that bolstered gay nuptials, setting off a firestorm involving activists on both sides of the issue. But he's going dormant now. He's going to ground. You're not going to hear a word out of Dan Cathy the rest of his life on the preeminent moral issue of our time, even though he is an evangelical Christian. While Cathy hasn't changed his position, he's just going to keep it to himself. While he hasn't changed his position, he told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution last week that he regrets getting involved in the debate. Quote, every leader goes through different phases of maturity, growth, and development, and it helps to recognize the mistakes that you make. So he says, look, I once publicly expressed my view about marriage. But when I did that, I wasn't as mature as I am today. That was in my years of immaturity. I hadn't grown as much as I have grown in the last 2 years. I hadn't developed as much as I have developed in the last couple of years. That was a mistake, and I have learned from my mistake. That's the next thing he says. You learn from those mistakes. If not, you're just a fool. I'm thankful that I lived through it and learned a lot from it. So Dan Cathy, remember, we celebrated this guy 2 years ago. We showed up by the millions to buy sandwiches at his restaurants on August 1st, led by Mike Huckabee, Chick-fil-A Day. We showed up to support him. We showed up to tell him how much we appreciated his stand for righteousness and his stand for marriage and his stand for godly principles of sexuality and family. We showed up to show him our support. Now, 2 years later, Dan Cathy has gone into the weeds. He has disappeared into the tall grass. You are not going to hear a peep from Dan Cathy for the rest of his natural life. Cathy said his decision to keep his views on marriage to himself came after prayer and a conversation with a gay friend who, according to the Journal-Constitution, quote, helped Cathy understand why marriage was important to the gay community. So Dan Cathy now is basically surrendering a scriptural standard on marriage, and he is now being guided in the way he views, thinks, and talks about this issue by homosexual activists, no longer by the Word of God. So Dan Cathy been bullied and silenced into submission. Now, one guy who has not been bullied and silenced into submission on this is Ted Cruz. And this is what I'm getting to. We got a clear alternative now between Ted Cruz and Rand Paul on social issues. By the way, if you want to kind of weigh in on this general topic, give us a call at 888-589-8840. 888-589-8840. Join the conversation. Here is Ted Cruz, clip number one. Ted Cruz in Des Moines, Iowa, interviewed by the Des Moines Register, which is the leading newspaper in the state of Iowa. And Ted Cruz has been spending some time in Iowa, as has Rand Paul, because both of them have presidential aspirations. That means that voters, when it comes to the Republican primary, voters are going to have to choose. I mean, they're likely going to be more candidates than just Cruz and Rand Paul in the race. But we're going to have to choose between one of these two guys. Do we vote for Rand Paul or do we vote for Ted Cruz? Now, there's a lot that I like about Rand Paul. I made that very clear. I love his defense of the Fourth Amendment. He's the guy that's been taking on the NSA. I love his I love his stand on liberty. I love his stand on less regulation. I love his stand on smaller government. I love his stand on less taxes, lower federal spending. I love his stand on these things. He's going to be a fighter on those issues. I actually agree with him on foreign policy. He worries me a little bit with regard to Israel, but I'm with him that the American military ought to be reserved for protecting American interests and American lives. I'm not in favor of the United States military being the policeman of the world. John McCain wants us to get involved militarily in Crimea, and my view, as I think I'm on the same page with Rand Paul, no, that's not our fight. We don't have a dog in that fight. We don't even have the moral right to intervene there. We need to let them work that out for themselves. But his weakness on social issues, this agree to disagree, this big tent language, is very troublesome to me. Now, here is Ted Cruz talking to the Des Moines Register, and let's listen to what Ted Cruz says. And he's asked this question specifically in response to what Rand Paul had said about we got to agree to disagree. Des Moines Register asked him, what do you think about what Rand Paul said? Here's his response.
Look, I am a conservative. I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm a social conservative. I think we've seen that in order for the Republican Party to succeed, we need to be a big tent. We need to embrace American values that have been present in our country, have been present in every small town, every small business, every family for centuries. There are some who say the Republican Party should no longer stand for life. I don't agree with them. There are some who say the Republican Party should no longer stand for traditional marriage. I don't agree with them either. I think we should continue to defend our shared values.
So it sounds like you disagree then with Senator Paul.
I'll let him characterize his views. What I can tell you is my views are that we should continue to defend life and we should continue to defend traditional marriage.
So that's Ted Cruz, unapologetic, straightforward, in Iowa, key primary state. Look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to defend life and I am going to defend traditional marriage. So I'd love to know what you think about all of that, this kind of difference of opinion now that being staked out by Rand Paul and by Ted Cruz. What do you think about that? 888-589-8840, number to call. By the way, my column is up at rightlyconcerned.com if you want to read my observations about Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. You know, and the bottom line in what I say in my column is I just don't think Rand Paul's the guy for 2016. We need a fighter. We need a culture warrior, and Rand Paul is just not going to be that by his own admission. Ted Cruz, on the other hand, is. Now, I'm not saying Ted Cruz is the guy, but I'm saying that he might be because he's going to be a fighter on the stuff that we care about, and I do not believe that Rand Paul will. He'll be a fighter on some of the other issues we care about. He'll be a fighter on those, but on the social issues, the moral issues, which we think are paramount because of our biblical worldview, Rand Paul probably going to be AWOL on those issues. All right, let's grab a phone call or two. Let's go to Harold in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Harold, welcome. What's on your mind?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for taking my call. I just
Yes, sir.
wanted to comment on what you were talking about in the beginning of the program with the Republican Party and how they want to encompass, the social issues to widen the base. In other words, let's embrace all this stuff, and I totally agree. That's not what the party was founded on, and I can speak to your audience and hopefully the listening audience here in Oklahoma that one of our Republican congressmen who I've been to 2 or 3 of the town hall meetings over the last couple of years. I've written his office. I've called him numerous times on things, who is now going to run for the Republican Senate race because Tom Coburn's going to be retiring. And I don't know him personally, other than I voted for him and followed him and went, to the town meetings. Have had some phone town hall, things, and I have seen a slow progression of Congressman Langford leaning more toward, well, let's just go along to get along, and I don't want that.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're saying with Congressman Langford, and I've followed that, it's disappointing to me, Harold, and I think you see it over and over again. These guys feel like there's this tremendous gravitational pull to the center, and they feel like they've got to pull away from the social issues, and they don't realize, Harold, that when they do that, they are pulling away from us. They may think they're pulling towards somebody or something, but every move they make to the center is a move they are making away from us, away from the base. And I believe in a big tent just like Ted Cruz is, and my point is the Republican Party ought to have a tent that is big enough to have room for everybody in America that believes in the sanctity of life and the sanctity of marriage. Room for all y'all under our tent. Focal Point AFR Talk back in 2.